Today we look at 2 Chronicles 23 and 24. Yesterday, King Azariah, who had ruled for 1 year, died, and his mother, Athaliah, began to reign. And she reigned for 7 years. And after Azariah had died, there was no male of his family to be king, but this Jehoshaphat it says the king's daughter had taken Joash. He must have been about maybe 1 year old, and hid him. And it tells us that this king's daughter was the wife of the priest Jehoiada. And as we begin today, then in the 7th year, so the 7th year of this Athaliah's reign, the woman who was, the mother of the former king, he takes courage, it says, and he approaches several of the leaders, the commanders of the hundreds. There's 5 or 6 of them that he contacts, and they enter into an agreement that they are going to raise this Joash, who is 7 at this time. I think that's his name. Yeah, Joash. To be king, a 7-year-old, mostly because they weren't happy with the way that Athaliah was reigning, and because she was the daughter of the king of Northern Kingdom, who followed Baal and was leading many people astray. The temples and worship places for Baal had been rebuilt, and the separation from God was growing. So this priest Jehoiada and other priests gathered together with these commanders of the hundreds, and they take this 7-year-old boy and they raise him up to be king. And they have, Levites and other priests, organized into groups of gatekeepers. They work, a third of them at a time, and everything is all set up. And then in verse 11, he puts the crown on this king's son, give him the covenant, and proclaim him as king. And Jehoiada, the priest, and the others that are gathered together begin to chant, "Long live the king, long live the king." And it causes enough commotion that Athaliah, who has been reigning as queen or, leader, hears this, and she comes running. And when she sees what's going on, and it's musicians and singers and, people with instruments that are raising up the king, this young boy to be king, King Joash now, and which is a little different than what we read in Kings, because it was more militarily led there as we read in the books of Kings. But here now, this is with being the priests and the religious leaders is, there's a different feel to the coup that's taking place as they raise this new king up in place of the former leader, Athaliah. When she sees what's going on, she's upset, of course, and begins to cry out, "Treason, treason." They're going against the king, which, they're the queen. And it does seem like treason. Anytime you revolt against your leader, that's what it is, and if the people on the ship, complain against the captain, it's treason, it's mutiny, but they secure Athaliah, this woman who's been reigning. And the say is, well, let's not kill her. Don't put her to death here in the Lord's house. So they take her out to a different place, and she is then put to death. And this young 7-year-old begins to reign. And verse 16, it says, Jehoiada, the priest, makes a covenant between himself, the people, and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. And they do. They follow very much. Joash is king for 40 years, I think it says, and while Jehoiada, this high priest, is living, he is faithful to this promise to God. They tear down the altars to Baal. They take the high priest of Baal. His name was Mattan, and they put him to death in front of the altar of Baal, as a part of the destruction, a part of the turning back to God. And all of this comes into play, and again, Israel, or Judah rather, southern kingdom under King Joash, has many years of good that way. He reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of Joachim. So we have a hint as we read here that, things are going to change. Well, of course they do. But he became the father of many sons and daughters, and he decided to rebuild the temple, the house of the Lord. And they asked for the donations to come and see that you act quickly. Well, the Levites, didn't act quickly. There were no donations coming in. Nothing was happening. So again, King Joash gives a command, and they make a chest, an offering chest, to be put there so that people can come voluntarily and put their offerings in for the rebuilding of the temple. And the offerings come and are plentiful, and they empty this box on a regular basis and give it to the workers and to those who are in charge, and the rebuilding of the temple goes on and is completed. Verse 13, so those who were engaged, and they restored it to the proper conditions and strengthened it. And when they finished it, they brought the extra money to King Joash. And he then designated that money to be utilized to make the different instruments of worship, the altar and everything that they needed, the basins and all of the service offerings that way. And then verse 15, but Jehoiada became old and frail, and he died. He was 130 years old. I mean, this is pretty old for this time of year again, I mean, Joash was 7 when he began his reign. He's going to reign 40 years. He's going to die when he's 47. And, some of the kings, met their end, because of injuries. And, well, we find Joash does too. But to live this many years at this point in time was not the normal. I mean, earlier in the readings of, Genesis, Exodus and stuff back there, we had people living, hundreds of years, but not so much really anymore by this time. But after Jehoiada died, they buried him in the city of David among the kings. I mean, this priest is buried among the kings as a sign of respect for all the good that he has done for the people of Israel. And then verse 17, after the death of Jehoiada, we had that hint in the beginning of this chapter. The king listened to these other officers who were proclaiming different things than this priest Jehoiada did. And they turned away. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the house of God and their ancestors. They served the sacred poles. They began to worship Baal and all of that. I mean, how can they turn so quickly? But, I guess we know how the fickleness of the human heart. But God continued to send prophets. And one of those prophets was named Zechariah, who was the son of this Jehoiada, who had lived this 130 years, 130 years, and had been such an instrumental person in the return of Judah to God, to following God, and to the reign of this King Joash. But, they didn't like the message that Zechariah brought from God, so they put him to death as well. They conspired against him, and by command of the king, they stoned him to death. By the command of the king. So here this king who had followed God so well, listened so much to Jehoiada the priest, and had been swayed so far the other way, commands that the prophet would be put to death. And as Zechariah is killed, he says, may the Lord see and avenge. And at the end of the year, an army came against Joash and the people of Judah, and Joash was injured in that. And verse 25 tells us when they had withdrawn, leaving him, Joash, severely wounded, his servants conspired against him and put him to death on his bed. and he was buried, but not in the tombs of the kings. And so here Jehoiada, who was a priest and faithful to God, is buried among the kings, and Joash, who had most of his reign, served God faithfully and the people faithfully, was not then buried in the tombs of the kings. It's just interesting how all of this plays out, and everything that's happening seems to be going good for a while, and then boom, the fall happens again. And it's up and down and back and forth, and we understand how those things work.